Well, thank you everybody for joining. I'm Itzel Torres with our 3C Run group calling out of Ventura. Today we have Next Generation Passive Solar with Jennifer Rennick and Andy Peace from Embellish Spring Consulting. And before we get started, I just have a couple of slides to go over about, some things. So quick reminders. If you call in with your number, please share your name because that's the way we can confirm your attendance. And if you're seeking AIA learning units, you must attend for at least 80% of the training, and we'll have to verify that as well. Please use the chat to add comments and questions. We'll get to those. And then slides and recording will also be shared out with you. And 3C Run does not allow AI note takers, but if you need accommodations, please let me know. Next slide. And a little bit about 3C Run if you're new to our program. It's a collaboration between Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo counties. We work on energy efficiency programs, and our services are funded by the CPUC, which it is the ratepayer dollars that we bring back into our region. And with that being said, I'll hand it over to Andy and Jennifer to get us started today. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Excel. We're super happy to be here with you today. Here's our learning objectives for your AIA credits and zero net carbon design. You'll automatically be sent a certificate for your participation, so you'll be able to upload that if you're a licensed architect and wanting to use those learning units. And if you're AIA and you entered in your AIA number, that'll automatically get reported for those learning units. I will note that we have kept the learning units themselves at 1 hour. So it's, although in general, if you're here for 80%, I don't think we'll go, depending on how much conversation we have, we won't go the full hour and a half. But you do need to make sure that you're here for at least 60 minutes of it in order to get that one learning unit. So that's kind of our metric to be able to have the reporting process. All right, our agenda, looking forward to having this conversation and whatever participation you all are going to provide. So we're going to talk about the historic context of passive solar design and how we got to where we are in terms of thinking about passive solar, going through some of those foundational principles that we've grown up on, been learning in school. And then we'll turn it over to Jennifer to talk about what's changed. Why are we having a different conversation? Why do we need this next generation discussion, and what works now? So then a little touch on at the end about what's next in terms of emerging opportunities. So first, I want to just give that little bit of overview, why this class. And it starts more than 20 years ago with a group of folks getting together to make a nonprofit called Slow Green Build. Chime in the chat if you were a part of that or remember that organization. It was a precursor to what is now evolved into the Central Coast Green Building Council. And in those early classes, we're just like teaching like what is green building. And so one of our trademark pieces of information to share was about passive thermal design. And working with Turco Sims, he had coined this phrase of orientation, insulation, ventilation, and mass. And he would say OIVM, not oil, which was terrific. And then we added a D for daylight at some point. So we had DOIVM. And we continued on in this progression. Then there was a kind of a period of not a lot of activity specific to these kinds of trainings. And then we were able to pick up with 3C Ren. And a lot of our classes have been about the energy code, about electrification, and about heat pumps. And then I got an email from Turco saying, hey, love the classes, but really, what's with the, what happened to passive thermal design? Like, what are we doing there? So great inspiration. What happened to passive solar? So let's dig in. So historic context. in terms of, gosh, some real pioneering kinds of buildings at times trying to take advantage of the natural conditions. And the good news, of course, is that we've had a millennia of climate responsive design as humans. So this is Mesa Verde, kind of the epitome, poster child for great passive solar design, in that there's a lot of thermal mass. The overhead set within this overhang so that the high summer sun is blocked and the low winter sun comes in and warms the place. There's ventilation. And then up on the right, more local to the Central Coast, using reed, grass and reed kinds of structures. And then way up in Siberia, big trees were available, and you kind of make the tiny little fenestration and these kind of mass timber walls. So we've known how to do that. And then we had this 50, 80 years of maybe collective amnesia. One might say we thought we had all this energy available, and so it unleashed creativity and or maybe hubris. I don't know, trying to not editorialize too much. But the idea here, where a glass building faces exactly east and west, an interesting architectural representation, but energy-wise, kind of a disaster, a glass house in Connecticut, and then they supersize me of homes. So we've gotten into this. We entered into basically a crisis. So 1970s. Oil embargo, and oil and gas got very expensive and very scarce. And so we started to kind of adjust some habits, behaviors, and then there were requirements. And so, like, reducing the speed limit from 70 to 55 miles per hour. Oregon turned off all hot water to state buildings. So we had this kind of a reductive approach to the energy crisis. So it's like, we'll just use less, do less, which has its place and its role, but there were other ways to be thinking about it in addition. And so the solar energy movement, which had been quietly moving along, progressing, then became more institutionalized and legitimized. So that we had NREL established in 1974, and then began a Solar Energy Research Institute. Then federally, we started to have funding and investment in developing active solar design. And then in California, the 70s, we had the establishment of the California Energy Commission, which then developed the California Energy Code, which would take into account all of the research to date that was available to show what things would lead to efficiency, not just equipment, but about envelope and fenestration and all those things. Jennifer, always feel free to chime in if you want to grab anything else on this.
No, you said it. That was great. Okay. Keep going.
Okay. Woo! And so within this context is also like, how do we talk to customers about it, right? And so then we started thinking about different language. We talked about and continue to talk about occupant comfort, about saving energy and saving money, self-reliance, energy independence, and then even just the style and aesthetics. So the big picture strategy became passive before active, so that we would kind of remember that we're trying to reduce the energy in the first place, right? So here's a project by Bruce Severance, the Stern House down in Oceano. And in this case, orienting this lot on the kind of that long axis to be able to get the south exposure, both for passive solar and for active solar on this home. And in this case, he also for thermal mass used phase change materials. So this is an approach that continued. All right, so let's just touch on those passive solar principles. Jennifer and I, in preparation for this class, started just pulling books off of our office library shelves and spreading them out on the conference table. And we have a lot. I mean, there's a lot that's been written and researched and images. And so from the top left, that Passive Solar Energy book from the 1970s by Ed Mazaria, who then went on to found the Architecture 2030 movement. And then down at the bottom right is Ken Haggard and Polly Cooper and their more local book on passive solar design. So some terrific resources and inspiration for us as well. So here's some of the principles that we've grown up on, that we learned in school. Solar geometry, know where the sun is for your project, right? So this is kind of a recap. We're not going to, once you look at all those books, you know, in this amount of time, we're not going over all of how to do passive solar design, but understanding your solar geometry, understanding what's your climate, you know, is it heating or cooling load dominated? Occupant or envelope load dominated. I remember thinking like, oh, this is important to think about. So at the time, an office building that had lots of people and lights and equipment and maybe incandescent or even fluorescent lighting. So there was so much heat being made within the building, and that it was going to be cooling load to need a lot of cooling load, less about the envelope. Whereas in a home, one person, they're not generating a lot of heat. And so you need to think more about the envelope there, right? So kind of that consideration. Windrows, kind of a traditional way to show where the wind is coming, not only where and how much, but seasonally how much. So is that westerly wind, is that cooling and helpful in the summer, or is that more of a winter storm wind that we need to think about within our design? And then, you know, we would do a lot of analysis at all these sun angles. Again, Sims and Company sun path diagram, and that informed the overhangs. It informed how much thermal mass and where to put thermal mass. And then putting it all in practice. This is San Luis Sustainability Group, Congregation Beth David. It was one of the first LEED certified buildings in our county. And I think the first LEED certified synagogue in the world. So, and just it epitomizes all those passive solar strategies we were just talking about in terms of overhang, window placement. The most of the walls are straw bale, so a lot of mass. It's got that thick exterior stucco. But then the south-facing wall with a lot of windows is a stick framed. And you can see there's light shelves that bounce in for daylight. Down below the windows, there's actually trom walls, so tanks of water, and the exterior glass surface is black. And so the tanks of water heat up in the during the day, and then at night they're little radiators. Super effective. In fact, and sometimes they were too effective. They had to add seasonal shading because those shoulder months were getting potentially a lot of sun. So terrific model of kind of the passive strategies that we were going with at the time. Natural ventilation, again, lots of studies and experience that show us how to do this effectively. Low windows, high windows, right? Kind of a stack effect of bringing air up and through. Or another approach in this center one with a cooling tower. So in this case, there's warm air up high, and then you can actually add like a little bit of moisture inside the tower, and then that cools the air, which then drops kind of into the space through these openings down below. So another way to have cool air entering the building in this passive approach. And then, of course, finally, in those passive thermal design, passive solar principles is about daylight and having good daylight, balanced daylight, but then also starting that conversation about what does it look like when you integrate electric lighting, so that if you have the daylight, are the electric lights going off? Is it complementary to each other in terms of the design and the architecture? And so, and here we have a Charles Moore building. Beautiful. Okay, and then I turn it over to Jennifer to talk about what has changed.
Basically, what's changed is improved technology and computing power. And so everything that Andy said, all those principles are still true. It's still effective. You could still build that way and you'd still have a good energy reduction. But now, over the years, we've got better climate data, better software for analyzing buildings, and our California Energy Commission has, made Title 24 Part 6 a reality for all of us architects. And so we have to design a building that's basically energy efficient. And really, our current Title 24 baseline, it's basically caught up to everything that we used to talk about 10, 20 years ago. So, for example, this was a kind of it's a generalized diagram, but it's not far off from a project I worked on when I first was starting out working for Ken and Polly and working with Turco and Passive Solar Energy Society, et cetera, et cetera. We could in California build a house made of concrete block. We didn't have to insulate the exterior of it, and it would meet the energy code. We could get it to work with all the passive solar strategies, even without the exterior insulation. But then when we add all our passive solar strategies, we could show this dramatic decrease in energy use. And so it was amazing. And then over the years, Title 24 has caught up. And so now we're, all those passive solar principles are still true. It's just that, but little by little by little, the way the energy code has kind of shaped us and architecture education has moved in this direction. Now, when we go to design a house, and this is a house example, we're just a little bit more energy efficient than what we used to tout as all the passive solar. Great, amazing way to design. So kind of what's changed? Well, some of it is that we have better insulation, and better installation of our insulation is required. So that's kind of baked into the code. And some of the things we do now that we didn't do was really look at air sealing, all of the air gaps, using in blown-in products that really fill the whole wall cavity. So no gaps, no voids. With straw bale, the straw bales themselves were very well insulative. So that's why that had such a powerful impact back then, because you just couldn't get well insulated walls, wood stud walls back then. And now we go around and do things like sill around all the air plates and cut around electrical outlets, etc. So we have better insulation products. Yeah, keep going. You were right. Yeah,
well, I didn't know if you want to touch on the HERS as in terms of verification of that.
Oh yeah, good point. That's the other thing. True. HERS verification was introduced into the energy code. So yes, so we do all these things that you see a picture of, but if your project has a good HERS rater on board, and your insulation contractors are really up on QII, quality insulation installation, then the combination, you should have a house that looks a lot like these pictures. So, and that's improved the performance on a lot of homes, just having that in place. When I first started out in architecture, if you had fiberglass bad insulation, you could have huge inches quantity of tops of the walls and each bay not being insulated, and then someone might complain about it, so they'd try and stuff something in there, and there was really poor qualities.
Right. And that was still better than what it was, which was no insulation.
Right. I worked on a remodel house. The
Right.
homeowner was shocked when I asked him, well, what insulation do you have in your walls? And they're like, I don't know. They're 2x4. It's probably an R13, right? I don't know. You better check. And so he checks, he digs a little hole, and he ended up ripping the drywall back because he was so frustrated to find out there is no insulation in the house he had just bought. And presumably it was built during the era where the whole house was supposed to be insulated by code. Okay, so kind of fast forward, parallel tracks. I mean, coming out of Germany, we have passive house. So we hear a lot now in California, passive house. What's the difference? Passive house, passive solar. They both have the word passive in it. Out of Germany, it's much colder, even colder than our climate zone 16 here in California. So a lot of the work in Germany and in Northern Europe is about really eliminating thermal bridging, minimizing air leaks. Yes, high quality insulation and strategically placed windows. Yes, all that true. But the thermal bridging and the air leakage minimize are probably two main things that we didn't talk about as heavily in California. But if you were in Colorado, that was something you also wanted to do. And then with the houses being tighter, you need to bring in outside air on purpose, mechanically control that ventilation rather than just letting the envelope leak air. And then we layer on energy efficient heating cooling systems, energy efficient hot water heating and appliances, plus our solar PV and battery storage. And so now as a whole package, we can design zero net energy buildings. The passive solar part, thermal mass, solar orientation, that still works in California. But now we've got all of these other things that we can work with. So what we found, though, is that the thermal mass, what we were doing with passive solar, is a lot of thermal mass, and the thermal mass became increasingly expensive, but it provided heat storage from the sunlight coming through our typically clear glass. Sometimes it was still single pane glass. So we had a lot of excessive heat. And so to be able to store that excessive heat into the thermal mass of the building was a way to stabilize interior temperatures. And as our window technology improved, insulation improved, then we didn't need quite as much thermal mass. Okay. What we started to see kind of, I remember in the 1990s is at straw bale and other kind of thick wall assemblies were becoming popular. It was really nice for passive solar because we could have the thick wall of the straw bale provide lots of insulation. And then we were still working with windows that would allow a lot of solar heat gain through the glass. And we would mass up the building, so to speak. So we might have a house that has, even if they didn't do straw bale walls, they'd have thick insulated walls, plus they might have CMU or rammed earth inside the house, or they might have concrete or adobe floors, or all of it. And the conversation started to shift of, hey, wait a minute, with these other technologies coming on board, better windows, better ways to insulate our wood stud walls, and not every climate zone is like Southern California. Can we overmass our buildings? And is that actually giving us a building that has more carbon impact? We're reducing our operational carbon, yes, but then the building itself has so much mass. Are we having too much carbon in the initial construction? So that combined with are other improved technologies like greater lighting efficiency. So some of this too was that when we had incandescent, even compact fluorescent lights, like Andy talked about with the day lighting, there was a lot of heat given off by those lights, more than the heat from the daylight itself. Now with LED lighting, the solar heat gain gives off more heat than the LED lights. So we saw kind of a trend to not having so much glass. And then we have high performance windows now with the selective low E coating. So we can have glazing that lets very little solar heat in, or we can fine tune it and allow a lot of, relatively a lot of solar heat to come through. Air sealing, better insulation, better HVAC, better way of heating, and that continued conversation of thermal mass benefit versus the embodied carbon impacts. Now, with our higher efficiency heating and cooling systems, we now have heat pumps. And the heat pumps, yes, they use electricity to create the heating and cooling, but 1 unit of electricity into these systems, you could get 3, 4, sometimes higher, more energy output. So they were they're definitely more efficient than burning fossil fuel right at the building. And so part of the way we used to do it is use a lot of appliances that use fossil fuel directly. And we'll hit on that again in a moment. And then with our day lighting, we can look at the glazing and fine tune it. So this project, for example, we Studio 2G, we worked with Newcastle Glass to really get them the aesthetic colored glass look, plus fine tune the visible light transmittance and the quantity of solar heat gain through the window. That wasn't so popular or possible, you know, a couple 20 years ago. So in California, kind of put this in perspective, when in the 90s too, when we were still doing a lot of work with passive solar, our electric grid was not very clean. California was still burning coal back then to generate electricity. We were burning natural gas to generate electricity. So the electric grid itself was quote unquote dirty, as opposed to now becoming more clean with renewables. So we didn't push electric appliances very much because it was cleaner to have a higher efficiency gas burning appliance and burn gas right on site than to burn gas or coal offsite to generate the electricity, to get the transmission line loss, send it to your appliance, and then have an appliance that only had a 1-to-1, 1 unit of energy in, 1 unit of heat out. Extremely inefficient system. Now we have a grid that's more than 60% renewables, so it's non-fossil fuel. We have battery storage systems, and we're at a point now where our fossil fuel plants can provide only peak time of use when we get enough solar and wind and on the grid. So along with that, kind of case in point, now we have these better heat pump technologies for space heating, space cooling, heating your hot water, and we have induction cooking. So we've really kind of switched away from burning fossil fuels into the building and now into using electric resources that are coming maybe from on-site solar right at the house, and having it be many times more efficient and reducing kind of the load on the building in terms of internal unwanted heat gains. So we really, the buildings themselves are shifting more and more to what we call envelope load. So what now? So, oh, and then I have this book here, which is so fun for me because this is one of the, you know, solar pioneers, and the message at the last ACES conference I went to is solar still works, but everyone also was talking about passive house. It's like, okay, in California, all our passive solar mass strategies work. So orientation, use your mass strategically, but a lot of those benefits in the mass are baked right into your Title 24. So it's not like you should ignore it, but now you're going to layer on these other technologies to it, and you can reduce your footprint down even further and have zero net energy home.
And before I flip the slide, I'm going to just take this opportunity to brag about Jennifer, because this is the conference where she was inducted as a fellow into the American Solar Energy Society. So
thanks. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay. Climate analysis is kind of part of, still it's important, but a lot of architects, I noticed that we don't always dig into the climate data for the location, and partly because it's baked into our compliance software now. So if you're doing a performance model for your project, presumably the person you're working with who's operating that software has have a good understanding of the climate zone, or at least they'll be able to get you to pass your Title 24, which then in of itself is pretty good. So it's a lot, it's so much better than it used to be. So we don't think about it as much, but it's still valid. I think I see a comment. We'll come back to questions.
yeah, it looks like a great comment about the passive house.
After we get.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry, I can't read and talk. Andy can do the chat while
Yep.
So, okay. So California, our climate zones. In our area, a lot of us were dealing with climate zone 4, 5, 6, 9, sometimes 13, 16's cold, but it's not that populated in our area, and 15. So we have a variety, but mostly we're dealing with fairly mild climates in our Tri-County region of, climate zone 4, 5, and 6, and passive solar works beautifully in our climate area. The envelope definitely matters. We do recommend blower door testing to see that your house really was built airtight. And we recommend that you reduce thermal bridging and use continuous exterior insulation, which is the baseline in Title 24 anyhow, but a lot of us use trade-offs to get out of it. And wherever possible, to use low embodied carbon or bio-based materials. A lot of times now, we do slab on grade construction, but we insulate the slab on grade away from the rest of the environment, and we have drywall inside our building already. Turns out that's probably enough thermal mass for most of our climate zones. And you can add a little more, it doesn't hurt, and really comes down to how much money that client wants to spend. But when I say slab on grade, it's usually we're talking about an exposed slab on grade, not carpeting it over. So sometimes that comes down to an aesthetic choice as well. Windows are important. The majority of the window area should be south facing. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of an analysis of what proportions are recommended for our climate zones. Dual or triple paned windows are available, and they're within a good price range where you can get both dual or triple paned window packages, and they perform very well. And this is an example, of what they look like regular windows, but these are triple paned, and it was part of this existing home retrofit for zero net energy that was on the tour when I was out in Colorado. So This is just one brand, Alpin, that's available in our area, and they offer a variety of U factors and solar heat gain coefficients. So some of our climate zones work better with some solar heat gain coefficients than others. And I just want you to take a note that we've got like a 0.25 solar heat gain coefficient, a 0.35, and even a 0.57. So depending on your climate zone, you can really fine tune how much sun you want in. So for climate zone 5 here up in San Luis Obispo area, Santa Maria area, it actually is very beneficial to use a window with a 0.35 solar heat gain coefficient. But up in climate zone 4 and 6 through 9, you're looking at targeting a 0.23 and maybe even a little less for your solar heat gain coefficient. And that'll make a difference in your performance for your passive solar strategy.
And then Jennifer, just the U factor, that's notably really low, really good insulating, right? Because what's the max U factor that you're generally allowed? Is it point?
Well, coming up for 2025 code in January, the U factor now will drop down to a 0.27.
0.27.
And then with the triple pane, you can get it down to like these windows, 0.12, 0.13. So again, really kind of making a well-insulated envelope, but fine-tuning the solar heat gain coefficient so that we can accept solar heat in the winter when we want to, and then shade it in the shoulder and summer seasons. So for the kind of passive solar guidelines now for our area, so climate zones 4 and 5. So San Luis Obispo County, northern part of Santa Barbara County. We actually, for the south, we're going to target between 20 and 24% of our conditioned floor area. Take that number, multiply it by 20 to 24%, and that's how much south area of glass you can have. But we want to keep the total down to 25 to 35%. You know, climate zone 6 down in Santa Barbara. The south facing glass, its target is a little smaller, like 15 to 22%. And even the total window glazing, 24 to 30%. And that's because it's a warmer climate, you can overheat more. And then those windows actually can benefit from a smaller or from the lower solar heat gain coefficient. And then for the next climate zone, like 9, it's even warmer, and that's in Ventura County and kind of up and further and closer to LA. That climate zone, you don't want so much south glass, 10 to 15%, and maybe your total glazing is 16 to 24%. Now, Title 24 kind of puts these prescriptive maximums on everything around 20%. But with a passive solar strategy using the performance method in certain climate zones, you can actually get away with more glass, like climate zones 4 and 5, which I think makes sense because that fits with our climate zone in and around Cal Poly. The people who were doing passive solar in this area, it was a good fit, right? It was a good match. And then I put you're going to get a copy of the slides, by the way. And so then I put some climate zone information for you that's going to be part of the 2025 update with U factor and solar heat gain coefficients. Taking a look at a house, I ran it through some computer modeling, looking at climate zone 4, and I did this for a few of them just to kind of give you the background on how we were looking at what makes sense for passive solar. We've assumed a 2,100 square foot slab on grade. So that slab's our thermal mass, the drywall, that's kind of baked in. R21 walls with an R5 continuous envelope. And then in this case, a solar heat gain coefficient of the 0.23. So then I started to look at what can we do? Yeah, go ahead. click it, Andy, maximize our south window area. So making changes to the baseline window and then increasing the south glass until we had a point where it either flatlines or starts to give us diminishing returns on our energy use. And so the main takeaway for climate zone 4, like in and around Atascadero, is that the passive solar principles, the orientation, glazing, proportion, etc., thermal mass, they're all good strategies. They work. And then you just basically reach like this point where it just slowly keeps ticking down, more solar, more mass, but you don't have the cost benefit anymore. And then climate zone 5 in and around San Luis Obispo, it's really similar, but the solar heat gain coefficient windows need to be a 0.35. If you put the wrong windows in, you actually increase your energy use for climate zone 5. And climate zone 6, kind of a similar study, but overall, even though we might not see as dramatic energy reductions, climate zone 6, it's such a mild climate, we already start with relatively lower energy use the building needs per square foot. So the window area, 15 to 20% basically has the same energy use. It just shifts from heating dominant to cooling dominant, depending on how much south glass you have. So if you've got better views and you don't mind using the air conditioning on the heat pump more, you can add more glass. Or if you'd rather, situate the house so that you're using or wanting more heat in the winter and not so much overheating in the summer, use a little bit less south glass. But it's, the main takeaway is climate zone 6, relatively mild. You want to use the 0.23 solar heat gain coefficient windows and those passive solar strategies, they all still work. And then climate zone 9, it's got a baseline Title 24 budget that's much more generous than climate zone 6. It's definitely hotter. And because of that, there's a lot of times where you can overheat. So pardon me. So really, having our south-facing glass, even below 10% is, uses less energy than when we increase that glass up to 15 and 20%. So it has a need for heating, but it significantly has a greater need for cooling. So strategies that reduce the window area and the non-winter gains are important. So speaking of that, especially like climate zone 9 and even Atascadero up here in North County where I live, it gets hot. So it's really important to think back on our passive solar strategies of how to design for overhangs, operable shading to basically protect the windows from unwanted sun. And the operable shading is still an excellent strategy for our shoulder season. And what we mean by shoulder season is in the spring, it's relatively still cold. Same sun angles as the fall when it's hot, but in the spring, we want the sun. In the fall, we don't want the sun. So being able to drop shades or extend shades for the shoulder season in the fall is really important, and especially on the west. Okay, 1 second. Thermal mass turns out still relevant. So a lot of the projects we work on that are low energy use have insulated, exposed, stained concrete as the floor. If it's a raised floor, you can use tile and insulate the floor. For a lot of our clients, we do have them consider kind of the embodied carbon. So we're not trying to overmass the buildings, because it turns out carbon has a lot of impacts on embodied carbon. But the idea of using thermal mass as a thermal battery for passive solar and also night vent cooling is still valid. This is a house example in San Luis Obispo. So the orientation with the majority of the glass is within 15 degrees of south. This house uses triple paned windows, and the overhangs were calculated to shade the bulk of the window wall that can open in the summer, but let all that sun in the winter. And that these floors are also exposed concrete, stained concrete, and polished with insulative material underneath the concrete slab. And all the operable windows, basically then I like to call it, free cooling but free air conditioning is how I phrase it. Because one thing nice about the heat pumps is the heat and cool, but you could set your thermostat, let's say in the summertime, you could set it for cooling mode only and set the thermostat such that it's not going to kick on. You open up the windows, that nighttime temperature is lower than the set point on your thermostat. So that's just free air conditioning, and your heat pump doesn't kick on until needed, and then you can close up the house. So those passive strategies still work really well with homes that are built to the passive house kind of standard in terms of air leakage, rain screens, exterior continuous insulation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and then speaking about windows, ventilation, Andy's going to take it from here.
All right. So with the ventilation, I think there's that temptation of just turning on the AC and closing everything up. But of course, in our passive strategies, operable windows are still super important, and thinking about the effective open area. So single hung or double hung for the same kind of square footage of glass, you're getting a lot less effective opening in the single hung or double hung compared to a casement window. And tilt turn options kind of give the best of both worlds, and being able to give a little bit of top venting or be able to open it wide. So kind of getting the strategic use of whatever glass you have. And then kind of a consideration for the operability and maintenance and having those quality windows, and whether or not you want to have sensors in there. CO2 sensors for non-res makes sense, but maybe even residential occupancies, depending on where you go. This is a project called Living Places Copenhagen. Velux was a major researcher and supporter of this project. A couple of us had a chance to go and live in it for a week and understand how it operates. And during that time, throughout that summer, they did monitoring. So the house, you can see, kind of has a funny shape, and that's because of these passive strategies that they have skylights and then roof windows. And so it's made to take advantage of both cross ventilation and stack effect. So you can see that the first floor is connected to the second floor, and it's a little harder to see, but then there's actually an opening where the second floor can connect to the circulation up to the third floor. And so all of these have sensors. So everything is operable. There's an automatic control with an override. And then they close automatically if there's rain. And then they track the data. And what they found, I was impressed with. So for these months of July and August in Denmark, there was no heating and no air conditioning for those 2 months at all. There was the thermal comfort standards were met 90% of the time. 97% of the occupants were satisfied with the thermal comfort. So again, no heating, no cooling, just the controllability of these skylights and a really great envelope. And it met the European Union standard for CO2 89% of the time. So no mechanical ventilation in this one as well. Obviously, kind of a 2 months of summer, a little bit of a snapshot, but a good case study there. So for cross ventilation, of course, it's going to depend on wind speed, distribution of your openings, but you can think about having about 5% of the floor area should be net-free openings. So if you have a 10 by 12 room, a casement with that's 2 by 3, 2 by 4, something like that could provide that. Stack ventilation, again, depends on temperature differential. We've seen strategies that, in fact, try to elevate the temperature of the air up high in order to drive a stack effect. But in general, a good starting point is having a 20-foot difference between the center line of the low window to the high window. So that's kind of why you need those 2-story volumes to really get that rolling. And then the natural ventilation that you supplement with fans and ducted systems, right? So when the temperature is great outside, open everything up. But if you are heating or cooling the building, you're going to want fans. That's also, again, as Jennifer talked about, is in terms of passive house strategies, is to have heat recovery ventilation. These are point ventilation system, Lunos. They're little can kinds of points, and they come in pairs, and you run it. They just provide a low level of air movement. These are great for retrofit as well as new construction. And so this diagram just shows that you would still have your exhaust controls, and then you would have kind of these pairs of fans that reverse direction, have heat recovery and filtration in them. Daylight, we've touched on a couple of times, and as a passive strategy, it may or may not help with energy loads, right? So LEDs are so good that you can get your lighting from LEDs, but you can do daylight, can and should do daylight anyway for comfort, views, well-being. Also, the studies that show retail sales are higher in daylit spaces, student learning is improved, health and healing, people heal better in daylit spaces. So do continue all those great daylight strategies. And within that, that kind of window size and placement in terms of daylight reaching into a room a distance 2 to 2.5 times the height of the window. So if you have a 7-foot head height, then you can get 14 to 17 feet into the room, depending on the, those light shelves and the colors of the ceilings, etc. And for a deeper floor plate, you would consider using clear stories, maybe mid-building. This is Mind Body here in San Luis Obispo, kind of had a big high ceiling, and they had windows just on both sides, and they had windows up high, but because they were so far apart, you weren't going to get the balanced daylight. So they ended up splitting the floor plate to bring in half of one side to be able to get a high clear story window in that central portion. And then it kind of made a nice drop ceiling for one part of the building. So no top lighting needed here. And that also helps with keeping space available for solar panels. Balanced daylight, super important. In that study years ago about the education and learning in daylit spaces, it was improved for all daylighting conditions unless there was glare. So balanced daylight, at least 2 different directions. So in this case, this is a hotel in Palm Springs. This is my cat. And so you can see that there's kind of a big window wall just out of the view, and that goes to the courtyard. It's lovely. But the back wall was the street. And so they didn't have any windows at first, but we ended up working with them to show that having high clear stories both it preserves the privacy, but provides that balanced daylight kind of space. So visually comfortable. And just as Jennifer talked about the importance of shading for heat gains, heat and cooling thermal controls, that you're going to want those same types of shading for your sun. So sometimes users like blackout, so understanding blackout or your user preferences. Of course, there's electrochromic glass that I see more in magazines than actually in practice, movable awnings, all those kinds of things. And what we're finding recently is that there's been sometimes we've seen some unfortunate trade-offs of selecting glass properties without understanding the balance between solar heat gain coefficient and visible light transmittance. So whereas if you end up with a super low solar heat gain coefficient, then you might also end up inadvertently with a really low visible light transmittance. So the lower, that's kind of a darker to be able to see out. And just as kind of a benchmark there, for the views credit in LEED certification, it needs to be at least 40.4 visible light transmittance or higher. So these other ones, you still get some view, but what they're basically saying is that it starts to get really limited. So be thoughtful about that comparison. The other conversation that we have a lot about is skylights versus sun tubes. So sun tubes are almost thermally invisible because they have that Fresnel lens and the metal mirrored tube, and it brings in light, but it doesn't connect to nature. It doesn't have that drama. It's not operable. So we used to use it a lot more in order to balance daylight because of the daylight was less energy impactful than electric lighting. But now, since it's shifted, we end up like, is it better to just have an LED, or do we want the sun tube? So it's a balance of, I think both skylights and sun tubes have their role in design, but just being strategic about when to use which. Also, in terms of making the best use of the windows where you have them, pulling back individual offices from window walls is a great design strategy, rather than trying to borrow light from an office into interior spaces. So here's a project where the circulation is along the window wall. You can kind of see up high windows that are bringing light further back. Here's a medical office, where again, they were going to put some of the office space against the window wall, but they pulled the reception to the interior so that the entire waiting area could have the shade. So this is an office building on the right with a big floor plate, and so unfortunately the exterior, the individual offices get a lot of daylight. In fact, sometimes will get overheated because proportionally from the outside, you design these big window walls to be able to, put daylight into the office. But then by the time you break it up inside, then you end up with these offices that have too much window and the interior spaces that don't get quite enough. You can try to glaze the office walls. In this case, it turned out expensive. So it kind of had a bit of a lost opportunity there. And then in terms of that top lighting, here's a study where the bluish color means more light, darker red color is less light. And so they're showing a retrofit. So there's just the exterior window walls, and they asked this first one, that's the daylight study with no skylights. Then they asked, how would it be if we did central skylights? So you end up with kind of 4 clustered skylights, a lot of daylight, which has some drama. Another option that we presented was distributed skylights. Not that one is better than the other, but just as an opportunity to show like, oh, you can have more even light throughout the space, and even brought in one additional skylight in a space that's particularly dark and might otherwise have that potential for glare if we don't have the balance with the exterior light. And then as you go through these passive strategies to have the complementary mechanical systems, like designing for off. So we mentioned that how many times have you gone into a space that has fabulous daylighting and the electric lights are still on? So being able to have those go off automatically, not come on unless they are switched on, or some kind of a thoughtful control that way. And then whole house ventilation. It is so important for us to have whole house ventilation, and it's required by code. But by code, you are also required to have an off switch. That's because if the outdoor air quality is lousy, that they want to make sure it's accessible to a user to be able to turn off the ventilation. Well, you can still turn off that ventilation if you don't need it because the weather is amazing and you have your windows open. So having complementary systems, and then being thoughtful about, okay, air conditioning. Sure, you might have a lot of great windows, but if it's super noisy, what is the user expectation on those? All right, and then kind of moving towards wrapping up here a little bit on what is next. Just kind of what are the other conversations that we're seeing in the passive solar kind of conversations. So here's some cottages in Chile, and I love this because the passive strategies are super visible in terms of kind of a low opening on one side and a high opening on the other for this cross ventilation. It gives lovely daylight, and you just kind of understand what is going on with that space. So summary, passive solar design is alive and well. There are emerging concerns, right? Started to see a little bit of conversation about that we want to follow up with, about fire risks, smoke, indoor air quality, other climate, potential climate change impacts, floods, droughts, power outages, whether intentional or emergent, and then just load shifting, the strain on the grid. So all of these reasons. So emerging opportunities, as we've talked about, kind of the technology, the advances in energy storage, microgrids, being able to have that bit of resilience, detailing, material availability, kind of global awareness and leadership in this world, regenerative design approach. And I think that there's, without thinking about these strategies, is that there's a potential for our own hubris, right? So as much as I was judgy about like, oh, we've got all this oil and energy, I think that there's a potential for us to do that again in terms of, wow, we've got all this renewable energy, so it's no impact. And it's, of course, always going to have impact. So we want to continue on a progression, and that I think a lot of folks have been along for a long time. And so just, again, kind of having a collective awareness. Code compliance is really about doing things that are less bad, sustainable, LEED certification, those types of things, are trying to be neutral, just trying to have like no new impact. Whereas this kind of next step of regenerative design is about healing. So can we have our projects actually help heal the injury that the planet has and continues to experience? So here's a forest building in Milan. A friend of mine saw this when she was vacationing and took a picture to send to me, like, oh, Andy will want to see this, right? So it's every balcony has all these trees all over it, right? So an urban site that had been highly developed. And so as they were wanting to provide housing to be able to, like, how do we restore this site and the forest that was lost? And then another project with kind of vegetated roofs. How are we utilizing all of our space to be able to be good for the earth? Biophilic design is a concept where it builds on humans' innate attachment, care for nature. And so this kind of design connects occupants with nature. Could be daylight and views, natural materials, even how we arrange spaces to mimic how evolutionarily we like to have places of refuge, places of view. And it dovetails with passive design, right? Because daylight, circadian rhythms, natural ventilation, we want to feel that air movement, plants and water elements. So in addition to reducing energy, there's also this kind of lovely nexus with occupant well-being and kind of a healing of of humans as well as ecology. And biomimicry kind of fits into this as well, right? So looking at natural systems, how what strategies is nature using? This is a local termite mound in Zimbabwe, where the design team studied that termite mound and kind of the intricate tunnels and air movement and mass that are engaged, and then developed this large building that has both offices and retail, and this stack effect. So there is a mechanical, there's a low level fan, but it's about 70% less energy for conditioned air, as it were, than a regular one. And then it ends up with this kind of delightful interior atrium as well, as just a fun space and much more comfortable. And so now to have wrap up and discussion. As we said, site responsive design is timeless, and that the solar principles, passive solar strategies are still effective, with some key updates, just making sure we're not relying on old information, that we're connecting to what's current with our building science and technology, and integrating all these strategies to reduce energy, improve health and comfort, and promote resilience. With that, I will let Itzel have a couple of slides, and then we'll stop sharing and seeing if there's discussion. If you need to jump off, we will not be offended, but hopefully we can have some discussion and engagement.
Thank you so much, Andy and Jennifer. That was a really good training. I wanted to launch our BPT poll. Any feedback information really helps us inform how we design our program, so all feedback is very welcome. And a little bit about next steps. For continuing units, if you have any questions, you could email my colleague, Chloe Swick, and I will add her email in the chat in a moment for any questions regarding learning units. And coming to your inbox, we'll have slides and recordings, and then upcoming courses. Last call, our certified passive house designer consultant fall cohort is coming to a close on October 2nd. So if you're interested, please sign up for that. And then we have some energy code trainings, all electric retrofits trainings, health and resilience of clean energy homes, and a happy hour in Santa Barbara coming soon as well. I will add our calendar in the chat as well momentarily. And also just a reminder, we have our Energy Code Coach service. If you have any questions related to the Energy Code Title 24 Part 6, we have our wonderful coaches that could help you navigate that very complicated process. And with that, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Our website is also on here. And I'll hand it back to Andy and Jennifer to answer some questions.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I know there was a little bit of kind of comments about Passive House. Folks are welcome to chime in. You can come on camera and unmute, or raise your hand, or type your question into the chat. So questions, comments, observations, we love hearing it all.
I recognize a few names out there. So, and I know they've been doing this for a while. What are you guys seeing? What are you just trying to meet the code? Are any of your clients asking for passive house? Do they know what that is? Or are they asking for anything unusual or energy savings? Resiliency, we're finding there's a great overlap with air sealing, better air sealing, better ways of building, and fire. improvements, fire prevention improvements, feel free to jump in and talk to us.
Interesting. There is an observation here about kind of the conversation of comfort versus energy efficiency, like which is the driver versus which is the bonus. And we've talked about that passive house was developed for health and comfort in Germany first, before it was energy, climate, environment wasn't the driver of developing that. So folks obviously still have thermostats. They can adjust it for individual comfort, operable windows, have a blanket or a sweater, all those individual.
Yeah. Well, passive solar, that was kind of the big selling point, right? For decades was you could be a heck of a lot more comfortable in a passive solar house, and you could get, in many cases, more windows with greater views and comfort with passive solar. And so that's kind of how that was that selling point a lot of times for the custom residential homes, was that it was like this win-win for both those things. Yes, and these passive features like passive house, but passive solar features. There's a comment from, hey, Todd, you can unmute if you want to join the conversation. But yeah, multifamily projects employing a lot of these strategies as well. We're working on, we've worked on several projects where that has been implemented. The code requires you still have mechanical ventilation anyway, so we've got that, but we've worked on projects where we've got balanced ventilation, and then worked with the architects to optimize the solar heat gain coefficient on the glass, but then the architects also looked at the orientation and making sure that everything was shaded if we couldn't get due south orientation.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. The glass properties and shading still super helpful depending on kind of load dominated. I think you also just kind of as a design principle have designing outdoor spaces to be comfortable in different seasons. So, something that's on the north side with overhangs, that's going to be more comfortable in the summer when it's hot, depending on the climate, or a nice south exposure kind of patio for more of a winter setting. So being thoughtful about outdoor spaces as well as indoor spaces, I think really matters, especially for multifamily housing where you may not have as your own private outdoor space.
I noticed in the chat someone had referenced a couple of passive house certified multifamily projects. So those exist. And it's a lot of the strategies for the spaces minimizing the thermal bridging, being airtight, something that we would see in more of the high-rise multifamily that we've worked with the architects to eliminate was when they maybe were doing podium or concrete floors and extending that concrete out for the balconies. Those became huge thermal bridges. So there are products available now where you can thermally break that. And so it doesn't impact the individual dwelling units as much. And so there are ways to improve multifamily projects. And also coming up in the 2025 code, multifamily projects, they're going to have more HERS testing. It'll be called ECC for energy code compliance testing, and you'll have an ECC rater instead of a HERS rater. Same person, same thing, just a new name change. But they're going to come out and and be required to do envelope leakage testing for multifamily now, just to improve all those things. So the code kind of keeps marching along.
Absolutely. All right, Jennifer, I think we did it. Thanks everyone for your comments. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up. And great to see you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.